The first time Salvatore Ferraro called Rosalind Calloway his girlfriend, she'd just spilled an entire tray of limonata across the polished Italian leather shoes of a man she had no idea was the most feared right hand on the Boston waterfront. Limonata splashed across the grass, and the whole garden, loud with the elegant laughter of a family gala a second earlier, went still like someone had frozen time. Roz stood frozen, 27 years old, thin inside the simple summer dress she'd carefully chosen, ash blonde hair tied back with a stretched-out elastic, gray eyes that belonged to a woman who'd long since stopped asking anyone for anything. And then, right in the middle of that disaster, he stepped in. Salvatore Ferraro, 34, broad-shouldered in a charcoal-tailored suit, dark hair going silver at the temples, a thin scar cutting through his left brow that made his smile look like a polite warning. He set a hand on the small of her back, light, but the whole stunned family heard every word when he said, "Everyone, this is Rosalind, my girlfriend." Roz nearly dropped her glass, because, to be clear, she was not Salvatore Ferraro's girlfriend. They were only supposed to be playing a part, a temporary arrangement born from a late-night bargain at the diner where she worked. She was just the night shift waitress at Marlowe's, the worn-out diner where he'd turn up at 2 in the morning and leave tips so generous she'd assumed he was bad at math. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why his mother, a warm Italian woman with a failing heart, was so certain Roz was the girl her son kept mentioning. And she sure didn't know that amid the crystal glasses, the tuxedo-clad guests, and the heavy scent of wealth, an innocent conversation with a family member would soon unravel a secret buried for 2 whole years, one that would make her want to slap him and cry at the same time. The most powerful man in the room had chosen her, a poor girl with nothing to her name but her pride, and no one in that backyard, Roz least of all, understood the real reason until it was far too late to walk away. If you love stories about dignity, kindness, and hearts that find each other where no one expects, hit that like button to support the channel. Don't forget to share this video with someone you think will treasure it, and subscribe with the bell turned on so you never miss the next part of the story. 3 weeks before that fateful afternoon, no one in this world knew that a night shift waitress could ever order a man like Salvatore Ferraro to go get more napkins. Marlowe's sat tucked away in a hidden corner of South Boston, its red neon sign having lost its last letter long ago, its yellowish light spilling over cracked formica tabletops and worn, faded tile floors. 2 o'clock in the morning was the hour when the whole city slept, and only lost souls still wandered in. Truck drivers, men just coming off late shifts, and a few people with nowhere else to go. Roz was used to all of them. She wiped the counter with a faded rag, her thin shoulders sagging slightly after 10 straight hours on her feet. But her back was still straight, the kind of straight-backed posture belonging to someone who had learned that if she collapsed, no one would catch her. When the glass door swung open with the jingle of the wind chime, she didn't even bother looking up right away. The man who stepped in didn't look like the usual customers. His charcoal suit was so expensive it seemed out of place in that diner. His polished leather shoes reflected the light, and he sat down in the booth farthest in the corner, with the bearing of a man long accustomed to having every room pay attention to him. But Roz didn't. She carried the coffee pot over, set a cup in front of him, and filled it without asking. Because at that hour, anyone who walked into Marlowe's needed coffee. "Black," she said, not as a question but as a statement. The man lifted one eyebrow slightly, the one with the thin scar she would only notice later, then nodded. "No sugar." Roz pushed the plastic menu toward him. "The kitchen closed at midnight, so all we've got now is cold sandwiches and reheated soup," she said plainly. He looked at her for a moment, his gaze sharp as though weighing something deeper than the poor little menu, then answered quietly that coffee was enough. She shrugged, turned away, and that should have been the whole story. But he didn't leave. Ordinary customers finished a cup of coffee in 20 minutes, left a few coins, and disappeared back into the night. This man just sat there, both hands resting around the coffee cup as though he was warming something inside himself rather than his hands, his eyes fixed on the dark glass window where the only thing reflected back was the old diner itself, and Roz's thin figure moving back and forth. 1 hour passed, then nearly 2. By the time the clock hand crept past 3:40, Roz, who was already supposed to have wiped every table and turned every chair upside down, finally walked over to him with her arms crossed in front of her chest. "I don't know what kind of big shot you are out there," she said, her voice tired but not afraid. "But in here, we close at 4 o'clock, and I'd like to get home and sleep before the sun comes up." For the first time in all those hours, the corner of the man's mouth moved slightly, something almost like a smile but not quite, as though he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone speak to him that way. "You're not afraid of me?" he asked, his voice low and slow. Roz looked at him, then looked down at the stone-cold cup of coffee he hadn't even bothered to drink. "You paid for 1 cup of coffee and sat here for 2 hours staring out the window like you were waiting for someone who was never coming," she replied. "What's there to be afraid of in someone like that?" Something passed over his face when she said it. A very small crack in that calm shell. But it vanished so quickly Roz thought she must have imagined it. He stood, tall enough that she had to lift her gaze slightly, took out his wallet, and placed a folded bill on the table. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. Then he walked to the door. The wind chime jingled again, and his shadow dissolved into the South Boston night. It wasn't until she cleared the table that Roz unfolded the bill, and she froze in the empty diner, because what he had left for a cup of coffee that cost $2.50 was a $100 bill, folded so neatly it looked as smooth as though no one had ever touched it. She thought he must have made a mistake. She didn't know that the man who had just walked out that door never miscalculated anything in his life. That man came back. Not once, but many times. Always at the hour when the world had gone to sleep, and only Marlowe stayed awake with the people who couldn't sleep, and Roz gradually grew used to seeing that tall figure sitting in the hidden corner, always ordering black coffee with no sugar, always leaving tips that made her more bewildered than grateful. Frankie, the 55-year-old head cook with faded tattoos covering his arms, and a heart softer than the pudding he often saved for Roz to take home, noticed it. "That girl," he murmured through the small pass window between the kitchen and the counter. "That man looks at you the way people look at something they thought they'd lost." Roz only rolled her eyes and told him to mind the soup pot, but she didn't deny it. The night everything changed was a Friday night, when the diner was busier than usual, and a large man had already had too much to drink before he even walked in. He sat at the counter, getting louder and louder, and when Roz brought him the bill, he grabbed her wrist, his fingers tightening so hard she had to grit her teeth, his mouth slurring words she had heard too many times in her life for them to shock her anymore, only to make her tired. Frankie rushed out from the kitchen, but he was 55, his back was bad, and the man was half again his size. In that moment when the whole diner seemed to hold its breath, Roz still didn't call for help, didn't beg, only quietly tried to pull her hand free with the resigned look of someone used to handling things alone. And it was that quietness that hurt most of all. Then a shadow fell across the counter. The man in the charcoal suit was in no hurry. He set his coffee cup down with a motion so strangely slow it seemed almost deliberate, then stepped forward, not rolling up his sleeves, not making a fist, not speaking a single loud threat. He only bent down very close to the drunk man, close enough that only the two of them could hear, and said something in a low voice so soft that even Roz, standing right beside them, couldn't catch it all, only a few scattered words, a name, a place down by the harbor, and the final 3 words, spoken as lightly as breath yet making the air in the diner seem to freeze solid. The strange thing happened immediately afterward. The drunk, who only moments before had been raging like an animal, suddenly went ashen. The hand gripping Roz's wrist released at once, as though she were burning coal. He stammered something that sounded like an apology, then shot to his feet, knocking into the stool, and almost ran out the door, leaving behind the unpaid bill and a diner stunned into silence. The man did not look after him. He turned to Roz, and for the first time since that first night, the sharp coldness in his eyes softened into something almost like concern. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Roz rubbed the red marks on her wrist, stared at him, and what filled her mind then wasn't fear, but a question growing so large she couldn't hold it back. "What did you say to him?" she asked. The man merely picked up his coffee cup again, his expression returning to calm, as though nothing had happened. "I only reminded him that this city is smaller than he thinks," he replied, and said nothing more. But Roz wasn't a fool. She had lived long enough in South Boston to know that only one kind of man could make a huge drunk sober up in 3 seconds, and run like he had seen a ghost, and that kind of man never introduced himself. That night, after he had gone, Frankie came to stand beside her at the counter, wiping his hands on his stained apron, his voice much lower than before. "Do you know what people say about men who dress like that and keep drifting around the harbor?" he said. Roz stayed silent, looking out the window where the man's shadow had long since dissolved into the night. She didn't answer Frankie, because for the first time, She realized that the strange sense of safety she felt whenever he was in the diner might be the very thing she needed to be most wary of, and that the man who always left behind a neatly folded $100 bill was carrying a secret whose outermost edge she had just touched. A few nights after that incident, the man returned to Marlowe's, but this time he did not come alone. With him was an older woman, small in a wine-colored wool coat, her silver hair gathered neatly in a bun, and her brown eyes so warm that Roz felt something inside her soften the moment she saw her. The man pulled out a chair for her with a tenderness Roz had never seen in him before, carefully supporting her elbow as though she were made of glass, and that gesture alone told Roz who the woman was before he even had a chance to introduce her. "My mother," he said quietly. "Antonia." The woman looked up at Roz, and her face lit up the way someone's face does when she has finally found something she has been waiting for a long time. "You're that girl, aren't you?" she exclaimed, her wrinkled hands taking Roz's across the counter before Roz could react. Roz looked at the man in confusion, but he only pressed 2 fingers lightly to his temple, with the look of someone watching something beyond his control begin rolling downhill. Antonia, however, paid no attention to that at all. She simply kept talking, saying that for so long now her son had been mentioning a girl who worked at a night diner. A kind girl. A girl who didn't care about money, who treated people like human beings, instead of like wallets. She said her son had never spoken about anyone that way before, and that she had been praying for years for this day to come. Roz opened her mouth to correct her, to say there had been some kind of misunderstanding, that she and this man had not even exchanged more than 10 sentences that weren't about coffee, but then she saw Antonia's face, that clear and fragile joy, and the words caught in her throat. Frankie brought Antonia a bowl of hot soup no one had ordered, and she ate it one slow spoonful at a time, occasionally pausing to place a hand over her chest, a fleeting gesture that Roz, long familiar with hospitals and illness, recognized at once. The man recognized it too, his gaze following his mother's hand with a worry carefully hidden beneath his calm surface. "My mother has a heart condition," he said softly to Roz, when Antonia was busy looking at the old photographs hanging on the diner wall. "The doctors say she needs to avoid any distress." Roz nodded, and in that moment she understood why he had not stopped his mother, why he had allowed this misunderstanding to continue, because there are joys so fragile that people cannot bring themselves to shatter them, even when they know they are built on sand. Before leaving, Antonia took Roz's hand tightly again, her brown eyes shining, and said that the family would be holding a 4th of July barbecue at home, that everyone would gather there, and that she truly hoped Roz would come. "You must come, child," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've waited too long to see my boy bring home someone decent, someone from outside his world." The phrase "outside his world" made Roz pause, because it revealed that there was some world Antonia longed for her son to escape, a world she believed Roz could be the thread pulling him back toward the light. Roz looked at the man, waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to rescue her, but he only looked back at her with dark eyes she could not read, and his silence said more than any plea could have. After the mother and son had left, with Antonia still turning back to wave through the glass as though saying goodbye to a daughter she had only just found again after many years, Roz stood motionless behind the counter, the slip of paper with their address written on it, which Antonia had pressed into her hand, still warm from the older woman's palm. Frankie came to stand beside her, wiping a cup with the corner of his apron, and said quietly that the old woman was truly kind, truly pitiful. Roz did not answer. She only looked down at the carefully written address, and for the first time she wondered whose story she had accidentally stepped into, and whether she still had any way back. The next night, the man returned to the diner alone, and this time he did not sit in his usual hidden corner, but walked straight to the counter, where Roz was wiping the last of the glasses. He stood there for a while, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, wearing the expression of a man preparing to say something he himself was not comfortable having to say. "I need to apologize to you," he began, "for what my mother said last night." Roz set the glass down, crossed her arms, and waited. "She misunderstood," he continued, his voice slow and careful. "But I can't tell her the truth, at least not right now." Roz lifted an eyebrow and asked him plainly what he wanted from her. The man was silent for a moment, then said something so absurd she almost laughed. He asked her to come to that 4th of July party, just for one afternoon, and play the person his mother believed her to be. Roz shook her head at once, firmly, saying she was not an actress, she was not used to lying, and above all, She was not used to standing in the middle of a stranger's family, pretending to be someone she wasn't. She picked up the rag, intending to turn away. But then he added one sentence that made her stop. "My mother is holding something I need," he said, "and she will only give it to me when she believes I've found another path. Another life outside the world I'm living in." Roz turned back to look at him, and for the first time she saw on that composed face something like true exhaustion, not the tiredness of a long night, but the tiredness of someone who had carried something too heavy for too long. She asked him what he was talking about, and he only answered that some things were better for her not to know, that he was trying to get out of something, and his mother was the only person who could help him do it, but she would not help if she still feared for him. Roz stood there, torn between the self-protective instinct that had been sharpened through so many years and something softer she did not want to admit. "I'm not doing this," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "I've spent my whole life trying not to pretend to be someone else, and I'm not going to start because of a stranger." The man nodded, not pleading, not forcing her, only placing a folded piece of paper on the counter before saying that if she changed her mind, the address was there, and the party began at noon. He turned away, and the story should have ended there, if she had not blurted out after him, "Why me? There's a whole city of people you could ask." He stopped at the threshold without turning around and said softly, "Because you're the only real person I've met in years. The only one who looked at me without seeing what I could give them." Then he stepped out, the wind chime jingling, and was gone. That night, Roz could not sleep. She lay in her cramped rented room, staring up at the ceiling stained with damp patches, and Antonia's face kept appearing in her mind, the way the woman had held her hand, the clear joy in those brown eyes. Roz's mother had died when she was only 9 years old, and 18 years had passed since the last time a woman had looked at her with that much tenderness. 18 years since the last time someone had held her hand and called her child in a voice trembling with affection. She thought of Antonia's weak heart, thought of the gesture with which she had placed her hand on her chest, and Roz realized that what she could not pull herself away from was not that mysterious man, not the shadowed world he had hinted at, but the old woman herself, the woman who had accidentally touched an empty place inside her that Roz had thought she had buried long ago. By the time dawn was near, Roz sat up, picked up the paper with the address, smoothed out the folds, and knew, though she did not want to admit it, that she would go. Not because of him, but because for the first time in all those years, someone had invited her home, and she had forgotten what it felt like to be expected by someone. On the morning of the 4th of July, a glossy black car pulled up in front of Roz's shabby boarding house right on time, and when she stepped out in the simplest summer dress she owned, the man was already standing beside the car door, opening it for her with a formality that made her feel both embarrassed and strangely out of place. She slid into the soft leather seat, and as the car rolled away from the familiar streets of South Boston toward the suburbs, where the houses grew farther apart and greener around the edges, he began to speak, not with the ease of casual conversation, but more like a tactical briefing, every sentence clear and deliberate. "You've met my mother," he said. "She'll hug you the moment she sees you. Don't be surprised. My Uncle Gianni will ask you a lot of questions. He suspects everyone. That's his nature. So answer briefly, and don't sound too defensive. My cousin Mariella will watch you more closely than he does, but in a more mischievous way. She likes discovering what other people are hiding, so be careful with questions that seem harmless. And my grandmother, Nana Lucia, is in a wheelchair. She hardly says anything, but she sees through everything. Don't try to act in front of her. It's useless." Roz listened, memorizing each name as though studying a map of foreign territory, and she realized that the way he arranged people, anticipated reactions, calculated every move, was not the way an ordinary man thought about his family. She asked whether every family needed to be analyzed so carefully, like an operation, and the corner of his mouth moved faintly, though the smile did not reach his eyes. When the car stopped at an intersection for the light, Roz looked at the side of his face and blurted out, "Who else was in the house? What about siblings?" The silence after that question stretched long enough for her to know she had touched something. "I had a younger sister once," he finally said, his voice dropping lower, each word drawn from someplace very deep and very painful. "Her name was Bianca." He said nothing more about what had happened, only that it was the reason his mother wanted him to leave the world his family lived in, that she had lost one child to that world and could not bear the thought of losing another. Roz did not ask anything else. She had lived with loss long enough to know when a wound needed to be left alone, and she only looked quietly out the window, where luxurious limousines and grand estate gates drifted by, giving him the silence he needed. A little while later, he was the one who broke the quiet, asking why she had changed her mind and come after all. Roz thought for a moment, then said the honest thing she had never meant to say. "Not because of you," she answered, her voice small but clear. "Because of your mother." She told him, without going deeply into it, that her own mother had died when she was very young, that it had been many years since any woman had looked at her the way Antonia had looked at her, and then she said the sentence even she had not expected herself to admit. "It's been a very long time since anyone invited me to such a beautiful place," she said, still looking out the window so she would not have to look at him. "I'd forgotten what it feels like to be truly wanted." The words hung in the cramped space of the car, bare and carrying no plea for pity, and Roz felt his gaze rest on the side of her face longer than usual. He said nothing to fill the silence, offered no empty comfort, and it was precisely that respectful silence that made her feel seen in a way she was not used to. When the car finally turned onto a tree-lined road and approached a large house with a wide garden already ringing with music and laughter, Roz drew in a deep breath, and she realized her heart was beating fast not because she feared the crowd of strangers ahead, but because she had just allowed a man she barely knew to see a part of her she had kept hidden for 18 years. The Ferraro estate garden opened before Roz like a world that belonged to someone else, where elegant lights hung from the trees, the scent of expensive perfume and fine wine mingled in the air. A live string quartet played soft Italian sonatas, and somewhere, a few children chased one another across the lawn, holding delicate crystal flutes, laughing under the watch of several adults seated nearby. There were dozens of people gathered there, men in light-colored shirts, women talking and laughing loudly, and Roz immediately realized that even in that festive atmosphere there was still something different. A few men standing scattered along the edge of the garden with eyes that never truly rested, watching the entrances and exits more than they watched the party tables. She stayed close to the man, her heart pounding amid the heavy scent of wealth. Feeling out of place, she walked toward the refreshment table to ease her nerves, but a clumsy turn sent a tray of limonata splashing directly across the polished Italian leather shoes of a large, middle-aged man. The garden instantly froze. Exactly as it had in the moment Salvatore stepped forward, placed a hand on her back, and claimed her as his girlfriend. As the shocking echo of his words hung in the air, Roz stared at the mess, her mind racing. Looking up at the man's sharp, deeply suspicious gaze, she immediately recognized him. This had to be Uncle Gianni, the exact man Salvatore had warned her about in the car, someone who never believed in coincidence, and was already looking at her like she was an intruder. For a few seconds that seemed endless. No one said anything, until Antonia cried out with joy from the party table, and immediately came over with her arms wide open. She hugged Roz before Roz had time to put the tray down, her embrace so warm and tight that Roz almost cried from an emotion she could not name, and Antonia kept holding her, telling everyone over and over that this was the girl she had told them about, that her boy had finally agreed to bring the girl home. The man, Salvatore, still kept his hand on Roz's back, and through the thin fabric she felt the reassuring weight of that hand, like a silent reminder that he would not let her drown alone in this sea of strangers. Uncle Gianni pulled out a handkerchief to wipe his shoes, but his eyes did not leave Roz for even a second, and when he spoke, his voice was dangerously gentle, as he said it was strange, very strange, that Salvatore had never once told the family he was seeing anyone, and now he had suddenly brought home a girl no one in the family had ever heard of. Roz felt every gaze fall on her, and she knew this was the moment when she could ruin everything with one clumsy answer. But before she could open her mouth, Salvatore spoke, his voice calm and decisive, saying that when something was precious, a person kept it to himself until he was certain, and that he had never been as certain of anything as he was right now. That answer made Antonia glow, and made Uncle Gianni fall silent for the moment, though the suspicion in his eyes had not softened at all. A young woman in her 20s with black hair and quick, clever eyes came closer. Surely Mariella, her mouth smiling brightly while her gaze was sharp as a blade, and she held out her hand to shake Roz's, saying she was very eager to know everything about the woman who had done what the whole family had thought impossible. Roz took that hand, giving a smile she hoped looked natural enough, and in her heart she understood that the longest afternoon of her life had only just begun. Over the next half hour, Roz learned that playing the role of Salvatore Ferraro's girlfriend was no different from walking a tightrope between two tall buildings, and that he, no matter how cold he seemed, was a more reliable scene partner than she had expected. When one of his distant uncles asked how the two of them had met, Roz opened her mouth to answer, but Salvatore had already stepped in, saying that he kept stopping by the diner where she worked night after night just to drink terrible coffee, and Roz, refusing to be outdone, answered at once that her coffee wasn't terrible at all. He simply didn't know how to appreciate it, that he was the kind of man who drank 1 cup of coffee for 2 hours and still complained. The whole table burst into laughter, and in that moment Roz caught his gaze, a flicker of something almost like amusement passing through it, as though even he was surprised she could answer so quickly. They kept trading lines that way, Roz adding that he was stingy with compliments but so generous with tips it was suspicious, and he answered that it was because she was the only server in Boston who dared throw customers out at 4 o'clock in the morning, and with each exchange, the layer of pretend between them thinned a little more, slowly turning into something more dangerous than an act. Antonia sat beside them, reaching over now and then to take Roz's hand. Her eyes misted with happiness, and every time she did, Roz felt her heart ache with the sweet, painful guilt of giving someone joy through a lie. In the shaded corner beneath the trees, Nonna Lucia sat silently in her wheelchair, a thin blanket over her knees, and she did not say a word, only watched Roz with old but strangely clear eyes that seemed to see straight through the makeup of every pretense to whatever lay underneath. Once, Roz accidentally met that gaze, and the old woman only smiled faintly, a mysterious smile that neither judged nor approved, making Roz quickly look away with the feeling that she had just been read completely. Mariella followed Roz like a shadow, pouring her a fresh glass of limonada with a friendly air, then releasing question after question as though by accident. How long had she worked at that diner? Where was she from? What did her family do? Did she often meet people from the harbor district? And Roz, remembering Salvatore's warning, answered briefly and honestly wherever honesty was possible, because she knew plain truth was always harder to trip over than an elaborate lie. But the one who made Roz most wary was still Uncle Gianni. He did not question her the way Mariella did. He only stood at a distance, watching, the glass of wine in his hand hardly lowering at all, and when Salvatore was pulled away by his mother to greet a relative, Gianni finally strolled toward Roz, standing close enough that she could smell the cigar smoke on his jacket. "Girl," he said quietly, his voice mild, though every word carried weight. "I've been beside that boy since before he could walk, and I've never seen him let anyone get close the way he's letting you get close today." Roz kept her face calm, and replied that perhaps he had never looked closely enough. Gianni gave a soft laugh, but the smile did not reach his eyes, and he went on to say that in their family's line of work, a person learned one thing, that people who appeared at exactly the right moment, from nowhere, and were perfectly kind, were often the most dangerous people of all. He let that sentence hang there, then said plainly what he suspected, that he did not know who she truly was, did not know who had sent her, but he would find out, because too many people had tried to slip into this family through the door where the boy was most vulnerable, and this time, that door seemed to be her. Roz looked straight into his eyes, and though her heart was pounding, she kept her voice even when she answered that she was not anyone's person. She was only a waitress invited to a barbecue, and if he wanted to think the worst of her, that was his business. But when she turned away, her heart went cold, because she knew Gianni's suspicious eyes would not let her go, and she could not have imagined that the very suspicion planted in that sunlit garden would one day be used by someone else to turn her into prey. To escape Uncle Gianni's suspicious eyes, Roz withdrew toward the long table near the porch, where Mariella was rearranging several plates of pastries, and the young woman happily pulled her over to sit with her, pouring her a glass of chilled iced tea, as though the two of them had been friends for a long time. Mariella had the rapid, chattering way of speaking that belonged to a young person who liked to tell stories, and after a few polite exchanges, she began rambling about the family, about how different Salvatore was from his father, about how, although he was cold, he was the kindest person in the house, and hardly anyone knew it. Roz only murmured along, her heart still heavy from the conversation with Gianni, until Mariella said one sentence that made the whole world around her seem to slow down. "He hides it very well," Mariella giggled, "but I know everything. He set up a private fund to help people quietly, never under his own name, paying hospital bills for families he doesn't even know. I accidentally saw the papers on his desk a few years ago." Roz smiled and nodded out of courtesy, but Mariella still did not stop. She went on, full of pride for her cousin, saying that once she had read a file about a young man with a heart condition, a very serious case, and Salvatore had quietly paid off that enormous hospital bill for the boy's family, even though he didn't know them at all. I still remember the last name on the file. It was strange. I think it was Calloway. That name fell through the music, and laughter like a cold stone sliding straight into Roz's chest. And for one moment she thought she had heard wrong, thought her ears had betrayed her. But Mariella was still saying something about how sad it was that the young man hadn't made it in the end. And each word was another cut. Calloway. That was her name. That was Danny's name. The younger brother she had cared for through the final years of his life. The brother for whom she had sold everything she owned in the desperate hope of keeping him alive. The brother who had died at 20 because of the weak heart he had been born with. When no hospital would continue treating him after she could no longer pay. Roz still remembered with perfect clarity the day someone called to tell her the massive hospital debt hanging over her head had been paid in full by an anonymous charity fund. The day she had collapsed to the floor of her rented room and sobbed in gratitude for someone she believed she would never meet. A nameless benefactor she had prayed for every night over the past 2 years. Roz's hand tightened around the glass so hard she thought it might shatter, and she slowly lifted her eyes toward the far side of the garden, where Salvatore was standing with his body slightly bent as he listened to his mother speak, that tall figure suddenly becoming unfamiliar and overwhelming in a completely new way. That man had not accidentally walked into her diner that night. That man had known about her before then, had known about Danny, had known the greatest grief of her life, and he had kept it hidden through all those nights of sitting there with black coffee and no sugar, allowing her to believe he was only a strange customer who had mistakenly left too much money as a tip. The whole story about him asking her to pretend to be his girlfriend, the way he had said she was the only real person he had ever met, all of it suddenly carried another layer of meaning that she could not yet fully understand. And what rose in her was not the sweet gratitude she had once imagined she would feel toward her benefactor, but something far more painful and chaotic, both an emotion so deep it nearly stole her breath, and a simmering anger at realizing she had been seen through, known, and kept in the dark for so long without ever knowing it. Mariella, unaware of what she had just revealed, kept talking and laughing innocently, but Roz could no longer hear anything, the blood rushing in her ears in a dull roar, and she set the glass down on the table with trembling hands, stood, and mumbled an excuse about needing to find the bathroom. She walked like someone in a dream through the laughing crowd, past the flags and the music, her mind spinning with one single question screaming inside her: who that man truly was, and why he had chosen to save her life 2 years ago without saying a word. Roz found Salvatore on the back porch of the house, where the music and laughter from the garden had faded into a distant murmur, and he was leaning against the wooden railing, looking out at the empty yard behind the house, as though he had already guessed she would come looking for him. She stepped closer, both hands clenched, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with an emotion she herself had not yet found a name for. "You knew me, didn't you?" she said, not as a question but as an accusation. "You knew me before that first night at the diner." Salvatore turned around, and he did not deny it, did not pretend to be surprised, only looked at her with dark eyes full of things kept hidden, and his silent confession made the anger inside her flare. "Danny," she said, her voice breaking. "My brother. The kind stranger who paid his hospital bills was you, wasn't it? For 2 years I prayed for an anonymous benefactor. I imagined every kind of person, and it turns out it was you, and you let me go on not knowing. You sat there night after night, watching me pour coffee for you, and didn't say a word." She choked, and the thing that hurt her most spilled out, that she felt as though her pride had been bought, that all the kindness she thought she had earned on her own had somehow been sitting under the shadow of a debt she did not even know she was carrying. Salvatore let her finish, did not interrupt, and only when she had gone silent, her chest rising and falling hard, did he speak slowly, his voice so low and soft that she had to hold her breath to hear it clearly. 2 years ago, he said, I went to that hospital at midnight, not because of you, but because one of my men had been badly wounded, and I had to sit in the hallway for hours waiting for news. He said it was there, in that cold corridor, that he had seen her, a thin young woman curled on a plastic chair, having just received the worst news about the little brother she had fought to keep until the very last moment. He told her he had seen enough pain in his life to know how people broke when they lost the most precious thing they had, that he had seen the strongest men in his world fall apart over far less, and yet she had not screamed, had not cursed, had not begged anyone. She had only sat there quietly, her back still straight, And when a nurse came over, she had even lifted her head and thanked her in a soft voice, though her heart must have been shattered. He said that in that moment, in a place where he had seen only ruin, she was the only clean thing he had ever seen, a person who still kept her dignity even after the world had taken everything from her. Roz stood motionless, tears rolling down her face without her bothering to wipe them away, and she asked him in a choked voice, why? Why had he paid that debt? Why had he done all of this for a stranger? Salvatore looked straight into her eyes, and his answer was something she would carry with her forever afterward. I didn't save you, he said quietly. I just couldn't bear the thought of watching this world crush one more decent person. That sentence brought down every wall Roz had worked so hard to build around her heart, because it did not have the shape of pity, the thing she hated most in the world, but of something deeper, as though he too had once been crushed by the world in his own way, and had grown too tired of watching it happen again. He went on, his voice even softer, saying that after that night at the hospital, he had quietly watched over her from a distance, had paid that debt without leaving his name, and that it was only 2 years later that he finally found the courage to walk into the diner where she worked, just to sit there and watch her keep living, just to be near something clean that his world never had. Roz looked at the man before her, the man she had been furious with only minutes earlier, and she realized that anger was dissolving into something far more complicated and far more frightening, because for the first time in her life, someone had seen her at her darkest moment, and instead of pitying her, he had chosen to quietly lift her back up. The fragile moment between the two of them on the back porch was cut short by a change in the air that Roz felt before she understood what was happening. A strange quiet spreading in from the garden, as though someone had lowered the volume on all the laughter and voices. Salvatore straightened at once, his whole body tightening in the manner of an animal that had just scented danger, and in a single instant, his eyes turned cold. He took Roz's elbow, gently but firmly, and led her back around toward the garden, where she saw a strange man had just stepped through the gate. He was about Salvatore's age, wearing an expensive light-colored suit, his blonde hair combed back, and the smile on his lips was so broad and friendly it made a person wary, because nothing else on his face smiled along with his eyes. Roz noticed the whole family's reaction to his arrival, the way Uncle Gianni quietly moved forward to block half a step, the way the men standing around the edge of the garden subtly shifted their posture, and the way Antonia went briefly pale, before hurriedly signaling to a young woman. Within a few minutes, the few young heirs and children present were quietly escorted away to the private library by the adults, under the guise that sweets and a private magician were waiting, the heavy mahogany doors closing behind them, and Roz understood that the children had just been quietly removed from something the adults knew was about to come. The blond man strolled through the garden as though it belonged to him, nodding to a few people with false familiarity, and finally stopped in front of Salvatore, spreading both arms wide. "Sal," he said, his voice sweet as honey. "It's been too long. I heard your family was having a party, and forgot to invite me. I'm hurt." Salvatore did not return that familiarity. He only looked at him with a flat gaze and said this was a family matter. Cormac. And Cormac was not family. The man named Cormac let out a soft laugh. Then his eyes left Salvatore and stopped on Roz for the first time, slowly sweeping her from head to toe. And Roz felt goosebumps rise all over her beneath that look, not because it was crude, but because it was calculating. "And who is this?" Cormac asked, his voice full of amusement. "I've never seen you stand close to anyone like this before, Sal, and I know you fairly well." He tilted his head, his smile widening, and said it was interesting, very interesting, that a man like Salvatore Ferraro, someone who had never revealed a single weakness in all these years, had now brought home a girl. His eyes kept following as though he feared she might disappear. Salvatore stepped forward half a pace, putting himself between Cormac and Roz, and his voice dropped so low it became nothing but a warning, saying Cormac should leave while he was still being invited to leave politely. But Cormac did not falter. He merely raised both hands as though surrendering, still smiling, and said, all right, it was a holiday after all. He would not ruin the family party." Yet before turning away, he leaned a little closer, close enough that only Salvatore and Roz could hear, and murmured that everyone had a weakness, and once a person's weakness had been found, everything else was only a matter of time. Before Salvatore could step in, Cormac shifted his cold gaze directly back to Roz, his smile shifting into something sharper, less pretending to be friendly. He told her, in a light voice as though they were discussing the weather, that she did not look like the people in this world, and that was a compliment, but also a warning, because standing beside a man like Salvatore Ferraro was never free, and the price was usually not one a person got to choose for herself. He said that if she was wise, she should leave right now, before she became a piece in a game whose rules she did not even know. Roz felt Salvatore's hand settle on her back again, that familiar, reassuring weight, and she knew he was preparing to speak, to pull her out of Cormac's sights, to carry everything alone the way he always did. But something inside her, something that had been smoldering all afternoon, ever since the moment she learned this man had quietly saved her life without demanding anything in return, ever since she heard him say he could not bear to watch the world crush one more decent person, something inside her would not allow her to step back. She did not want to be protected one more time, did not want to be the person standing behind someone else in order to be safe. And so, before Salvatore could say anything, Roz did something that surprised even herself. She stepped forward half a step, standing beside him instead of tucked behind him, and she reached out to take Salvatore's hand, threading her fingers firmly through his, openly, right in front of Cormac and the whole watching garden. She felt him start slightly at the gesture, felt him go still for one brief moment in surprise, but he did not pull his hand away. Roz lifted her head, looked straight into Cormac's cold eyes, and said in a voice so calm that even she did not expect she was capable of it, that she belonged to no one, that she had never been, and would never be anyone's pawn. But tonight, right now, she chose to stand beside this man, and that choice was hers, not his. The whole garden went silent. Cormac stared at her for a long while, the smile on his lips stiffening, and Roz saw something like surprise flicker through his eyes, as though he was not used to someone with no power at all daring to look straight at him and answer back. Then he laughed, a low, dry sound, and said that was interesting, very interesting. Sal had found someone who dared stand with her back straight, and that made everything even more worth the trouble. He nodded in farewell, a gesture almost polite, then said one last thing before turning away, that they should enjoy the evening, because precious things were always fragile, and he had always been very good at finding the most fragile place in anything. When his shadow finally vanished behind the gate, and the sound of his whistling dissolved into the distant holiday music from neighboring estates, warmth slowly returned to the party. People began talking again. The children were allowed back outside to play, but Salvatore still did not let go of Roz's hand. He turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw true confusion on that always controlled face, as though he was trying to understand what had just happened. "You didn't need to do that," he said quietly. "You didn't need to put yourself in his sights because of me." Roz looked down at their hands, still woven together, then lifted her eyes and answered that she knew, but she was too tired of always letting other people stand in front of her, and this time she wanted to choose where she stood. In that moment, beneath the late afternoon sunlight turning golden over the garden, both of them realized something neither dared say aloud, that the line between the act they had built and the real feeling growing between them had begun to blur, and neither of them knew for certain whether the hand holding the other's was still for someone else to see, or whether somewhere along the way, without either of them noticing, it had become real. When night fell and the first bursts of fireworks began blooming across the sky, Salvatore leaned slightly toward Roz and asked whether she wanted to step away from the crowd for a little while, and she nodded, grateful to escape the curious eyes and the conversations she had to keep pretending her way through. He led her through the French doors of the ballroom, past the marble terrace, and onto the private deck of a luxurious yacht moored at the estate's private harbor, where the calm water reflected the glowing sky, and the sound of fireworks from across the city drifted back like summer sighs. They sat at the edge of the dock, their feet hanging above the water, and for a long while neither of them spoke, while the light from each burst of fireworks swept across their faces in turn, blue, then red, then gold. It was Roz who broke the silence, asking him softly whether he ever grew tired of always having to be the strongest person, the one everyone relied on. Salvatore was silent for a moment, then answered that in his entire life, no one had ever needed him simply for himself. People needed him for what he could do for them, for the protection he could provide, for the power in his hands, but no one had ever wanted him to stay simply because he was himself. Roz turned to look at him, and she realized that what he had just said was the very thing she had lived with her whole life, only from the opposite side, that people came to her only when they needed a pair of hands to work without complaint. someone to care for them without asking, someone who always gave and never dared expect anything back. And she had never been wanted simply because she deserved to be wanted. Two people, one with everything and one with nothing, and yet they carried the same wound, the wound of those who had always been needed but never truly desired. She told him that, and Salvatore turned to look at her for a long time beneath the fireworks, then confessed something he had never told anyone. He said that every night he returned to Marlowe's, it had not been because of the coffee. The coffee there really was terrible, he said, the corner of his mouth curving slightly, but because it was the only place in the world where someone poured him something without wanting anything back from him. He said that in his world, every kind gesture had a price, every favor became a debt, and only at that old counter, under the yellowish light at 2 o'clock in the morning, was he allowed to be an ordinary man, a customer served simply because he was thirsty, nothing more and nothing less. Roz felt her chest tighten at that confession, and she understood that through all those nights when she thought she had merely been doing the work of a waitress, she had unknowingly given this powerful man the one thing all his fortune could not buy, the feeling of being treated like a human being. A large burst of fireworks opened above them, scattering shimmering ribbons of light across the water, and in that bright, then dark moment, Roz felt herself leaning closer to him, close enough to see the fire reflected in his dark eyes. She asked softly, her voice trembling, whether this was all right, and Salvatore did not answer with words. He only looked at her, letting her decide, not pulling her closer and not moving away, giving her the full right to choose in a way no man ever had before. And then she, slowly and trembling, closed the last distance between them and placed a gentle kiss on his lips. A kiss with nothing of the performance they had played all day. A kiss so real it made her heart ache. When she drew back slightly, they were both silent, and the fireworks kept cracking across the sky, while two people, who had once believed they did not deserve to be wanted, sat there, shoulder to shoulder, quietly realizing that perhaps they had been wrong. When the final burst of fireworks slowly faded and the sky returned to the quiet dark, with only a few scattered sparks still glowing far away, Roz pulled herself out of that tenderness they had just shared, because inside her, beside the new feeling beginning to grow, there was still a clear voice reminding her of everything she did not yet know about this man. She gently slipped her hand from his, turned to look straight at him in the dim light spilling down from the garden lamps, and said she needed him to be honest with her. Right now, about everything. She said she had spent the whole afternoon putting the broken pieces together, the way the drunk man had fled the diner, the men standing guard at the edge of the garden, the way Cormac talked about weaknesses and pawns, Uncle Gianni's suspicious eyes, and she was no longer a child who could lie to herself and pretend she did not understand. She asked him directly who he was, what his family truly did, and Salvatore did not avoid it anymore. He said, his voice low and heavy, that his family had controlled the ports and the longshoremen's unions along this waterfront for 3 generations, that the logistics company called Ferraro was only the outer shell for the things buried far beneath, things he would not describe to her in detail, because he did not want her to carry that burden, and that he had inherited all of it from the father he both hated and could not escape. He said it was the world that had taken his sister, Bianca, from him, and that was why his mother, who held the nominal shares he needed in order to transfer and restructure everything, would only sign when she believed he truly had another road to walk. Roz listened, her heart pounding, and asked what he planned to do with all of it. For the first time all day, Salvatore hesitated, as though what he was about to say was a secret, even more dangerous than admitting who he was. And then he said he wanted to leave, wanted to cut himself completely free from that underworld, to turn Ferraro Maritime into a truly honest company. The clean side of the business his father had only ever treated as a front. He said it was what he had carried inside him since the day he lost Bianca. But leaving a world like that was never simple. There were men like Cormac always watching and waiting for the moment he left himself open so they could seize whatever he released. And that was why every move he made had to be careful enough to steal his breath. Roz sat still for a long while, letting all of it settle. And then she did something Salvatore did not expect. She did not seem afraid, did not draw back. Instead, she told him she had lived her whole life beside terrible things, hunger, loss, cold hospital rooms, and she had never been given the luxury of safety, so she did not need him to promise her that everything would be all right, because she knew very well that life was never all right. What she needed from him was something else. "I don't need you safe," she said, her voice soft but firm. Her gray eyes locked on his. "I need you real." She said this world had lied to her enough already, that she could endure the truth no matter how ugly it was, but she could not bear being hidden from again, being placed in a corner for protection like something fragile. If he truly wanted her to step into his life, then he had to let her step in with her eyes wide open, knowing everything, standing beside him as an equal human being, not as a secret tucked away. Salvatore looked at her, the man who had once made the entire city hold its breath, and in that moment, Roz saw something in him soften, an invisible layer of armor he had worn for so many years quietly cracking. He lifted his hand, slowly, and brushed a stray ash-blonde lock of hair from her cheek and tucked it behind her ear. A gesture so gentle it stood in complete contradiction to everything she knew about his world. Then he said softly that, all right, he would give her the truth. All of it, no matter where it led them. 2 weeks passed after the party, and in that brief span of time, Roz had allowed herself to believe that perhaps her life truly was beginning to change, because Salvatore still came to the diner every night, no longer sitting in the hidden corner, but taking a seat right at the counter so he could talk with her, and their conversations had become real now, with no layer of pretending left between them. But the world she had just touched was not a place that let anyone live in peace for long, and the blow came down on a morning that seemed as ordinary as any other. Roz was getting ready to start her shift when the diner manager, a man who had always been fond of her, called her into the small back room with an expression she had never seen on his face before, both confused and afraid. He set a paper down on the table in front of her, an official document with all the proper stamps and signatures, and told her in a heavy voice that someone had filed a report against her with the financial investigators, accusing her of being connected to a money laundering network operating through diners around the harbor, and that the diner was being audited, while her account had been frozen for the investigation. Roz stood frozen, feeling as though the ground beneath her had fallen away, because she knew very well she had never done anything wrong. She was only a poor waitress struggling from $1 to the next. And yet now, her name was sitting inside an investigative file with accusations that could send her to prison. She stammered that this had to be a mistake, that she knew nothing about money laundering or the harbor, but when she picked up the paper and read it, her hands began to shake, because the details inside had been assembled with terrifying skill. They had connected the unusual tips she had received over the past several months, the very $100 bills Salvatore had folded so neatly, with shadowy transactions at the harbor, turning his quiet kindness into evidence against her, and they had cited her connection to the Ferraro family as further confirmation that she was a link in that operation. In the moment she read those cold lines, Roz suddenly understood everything with horror rising in her chest. This was Cormac's move, and he had struck with cruel intelligence, because he had not used fists or threats. He had used the legal system itself to crush her. She remembered Uncle Gianni's suspicious gaze in the garden, the way he had openly said he believed she was someone's spy sent into the family, and she realized Cormac must have heard that suspicion, or somehow exploited it, turning the family's own doubt into the perfect story to make her look guilty. He had found Salvatore's weakness exactly as he had warned, and that weakness was her, a woman with no power, no money, no one behind her, the easiest person in the whole game to crush. The manager told her, in a voice full of regret, that he had no choice but to suspend her until everything was cleared up, that he was sorry, but the diner couldn't be tied to an investigation, and Roz only nodded without truly feeling it, folded the paper with numb hands, then walked out of that small room like a body without a soul. Frankie was waiting for her by the kitchen door, his face pale with worry, and he took her by the shoulders and asked what had happened, but Roz couldn't speak. She only shook her head, tears streaming down her face, because the feeling in that moment was far too familiar. It was exactly the feeling she had known while watching her life collapse in hospital corridors 2 years earlier, the helplessness of someone who had always tried to live honestly and still kept being knocked down by the world again and again. She stepped out onto the sunlit street, the paper clenched tightly in her hand, and for the first time in a very long while, the old despair covered her again, the thought that perhaps people like her were never allowed to have happiness, that every time she had barely touched something beautiful, the world immediately snatched it from her hands. When Salvatore heard the news, he came to Roz's cramped rented room that very night, and when she opened the door, his face was something she had never seen before, no longer the usual deadly calm, but a cold anger so intense it was almost frightening. He read the paper she handed him, his jaw clenched tight, and when he looked up, he said this was Cormac. It couldn't be anyone else. He had chosen to strike at her because he knew that was the way to hurt Salvatore most without having to touch him. Roz saw something dark rising in his eyes, the old part of him, the world he had lived in all his life, where a problem like this was solved in ways she did not dare imagine. And she took hold of his arm, whispering, Don't do something you'll never be able to come back from." That night, Cormac's men and the harbor security guards loyal to Salvatore had a tense confrontation, the two sides blocking each other between blackened containers beneath the yellowish lights, the air so thick it seemed one spark would be enough to set everything ablaze. Salvatore stood there, facing Cormac across the cold concrete yard, and in that moment he held every power to choose the old road, the road his father would surely have chosen, the road this entire underworld expected him to choose. Cormac smiled and challenged him, saying this was the real Salvatore Ferraro he knew, that the girl would drag him back to his true nature sooner or later. But Salvatore did not step into that trap. He looked at Cormac for a long time, then said in a voice so calm it chilled the blood that Cormac was wrong, that he had grown used to a version of Salvatore that Salvatore had decided to bury, and that this time he would not play by Cormac's rules. He signaled for the security to step back from that confrontation, leaving Cormac standing there with his smile frozen, because he could not understand why a man strong enough to crush him would choose to walk away. What Cormac did not know was that Salvatore had chosen a weapon their underworld had never used, a weapon more dangerous than any fist. Over the days that followed, Salvatore did something that even he, only a few months earlier, could never have imagined. He gathered every ledger, every file, every piece of evidence about the shadowed operations his family, and especially Cormac, had been tied to for years, including the things that implicated Salvatore himself. And then he went to the federal prosecutors he had been taught all his life to avoid. He handed over everything, making the entire flow of money through Ferraro Maritime transparent to prove that the tips Roz had received were only personal kindness and had no connection to any network. And by doing that, he not only cleared her of every false accusation, but also exposed Cormac's entire criminal web. The price he had to pay was enormous, and he understood that better than anyone, because in handing over that evidence, he was also destroying with his own hands most of the hidden empire 3 generations of the Ferraro family had built, trading away power, fearful respect, and even his own safety. When his lawyer asked whether he was certain, whether he understood that he was throwing everything away, Salvatore thought only of Roz's face the night she stood in that rented room, with the paper trembling in her hands, thought of his sister Bianca, whom that world had stolen from him, and said he had never been more certain of anything. He realized that all his life he had mistaken power for strength, that holding the ability to destroy others had never been true strength, and that the greatest strength a person could have was daring to let all of that go in order to protect the one clean thing left in his life. The night he signed the final statements, he did not save his empire. He let it collapse. But for the first time in many years, he felt free, and he understood that this was the one thing his father's entire fortune had never been able to buy. That summer closed with changes no one in the Ferraro family had ever dared imagine. Cormac Vale was arrested and prosecuted based on the very evidence that had been brought into the light, and the network he had so carefully built collapsed like a sandcastle before the tide, dragging down with him a string of names that had once believed themselves untouchable. Every accusation against Roz was dropped completely. Her account was unfrozen, and one morning the diner manager came all the way to her rented room, hat in hand, awkwardly apologizing and inviting her back to work. But what moved Roz most was not that invitation, but the fact that she had finally been given back the most precious thing she had always possessed, her clean name. The hidden empire of the Ferraro family fell apart, but Ferraro Maritime, the legal shipping and logistics company that for so many years had been treated as nothing more than a front, was still there, truly existing with real ships, real contracts, and real workers who needed jobs to feed their families. Salvatore kept only that part, the honest part his father had once looked down on, and he began the difficult work of rebuilding it into something he could be proud of, something no longer stained by even one shadow. The price he had to pay was still present every day. Doors that had once opened before him had now closed. Men who had once bowed their heads now looked at him differently, and he himself had to face legal consequences for his own past. But he carried all of it with a peace he had never known before. One late summer afternoon, Salvatore came to Marlowe's during a quiet hour. And this time, he was no longer the mysterious man sitting in the hidden corner. He He was only a man seeking out the woman he wanted to be with. Roz made him a cup of coffee, set it down in front of him, and the two of them sat facing each other across the worn old counter. For the first time in their whole story, without a single lie left between them, without a performance, without any armor to hide behind. They spoke to each other about everything, about what had been lost and what remained, about fear and about hope. Roz admitted that there had been moments when she was certain this world would once again tear every beautiful thing out of her hands, just as it always had, that she had been so afraid she had almost wanted to step away first, so she wouldn't have to hurt again. Salvatore listened, then told her something honest, that he had been afraid too, not afraid of Cormac, not afraid of losing power, but afraid that after he stripped away everything that had once defined who he was, there would be nothing left worth staying for. He said that all his life, he had believed his value lay in what he held in his hands, in his ability to protect and punish, and when he let all of that go, he had stood before a question he had never dared ask, whether the bare man left behind was enough to be loved by anyone. Roz reached across the counter and placed her hand over his, the hand that had once made an entire city tremble, now resting still beneath the thin, calloused fingers of a waitress, and she told him that it was exactly that bare man she wanted, that she had never needed his power or his protection. She only needed him, the man who had chosen to sit in an old diner at 2 o'clock in the morning just so he could be an ordinary human being. In that moment, beneath the familiar yellowish light, two people the world had once defined by outward things, one by poverty and one by power, finally saw each other exactly as they were, two wounded souls who had found shelter in one another, and for the first time, both of them believed that perhaps, only perhaps, they were truly allowed to keep this beautiful thing. That winter, for the first time in many years, Roz did not spend Christmas alone in her cold rented room. The Ferraro family invited her over, and this time not as someone playing a role, but as someone truly expected. And Antonia pulled her into an embrace right at the threshold, a hug so warm that Roz had to blink very quickly to hide the tears threatening to spill. The large kitchen of the house was fragrant with flour, vanilla, and orange zest, and it was there that Roz found Nonna Lucia sitting in her wheelchair beside the wide wooden table dusted all over with flour, her old hands still skillful as they kneaded a batch of dough for pastries. She looked up at Roz, her clear eyes sparkling, then waved her closer and told her to roll up her sleeves. It was time this girl learned how to make the pastry that Ferraro women had passed down to one another through generations. Roz clumsily did as she was told, her hands awkward, the hands of someone who had never been properly taught how to cook, and Nonna Lucia patiently showed her how to press the dough, how to shape each small pastry, occasionally tapping the back of her hand when she did something wrong with a loving little scold. When the two of them had settled side by side amid the fine white dust, the old woman suddenly spoke in a perfectly calm voice, saying, "You know, from the day you spilled that whole tray of limonata on Gianni's shoes, I knew full well the two of you weren't truly a couple." Roz froze, almost dropping the pastry she was shaping, and the old woman chuckled at her expression, then went on to say that the way the two of them looked at each other that day was the way two people looked when they were acting in a play they themselves had not yet memorized. Roz stammered, trying to explain, but Nonna Lucia only waved a hand, and then she said the thing that made Roz fall silent, that although it had been false in the beginning, the way the boy looked at her when he thought she wasn't noticing was more real than anything the old woman had ever seen in him, and an old woman who had lived through 81 winters could tell the difference between acting and a heart that was truly beating. She said she had kept quiet all this time, not because she didn't know, but because there are real things that need time for the people inside them to recognize, and she had simply sat there waiting, like a patient gardener waiting for a seed to sprout on its own. Roz looked at the old woman, her heart filled with a warmth so deep it almost choked her, and she softly asked whether Nonna Lucia was angry with her for taking part in that performance. Nonna Lucia placed her flour-covered hand over Roz's, her eyes gentle, and said, "How could I be angry when you are the best thing that has come into this house in a very long time? You brought the boy back, not back to this house, but back to himself, back to the man he should have been allowed to become." From the next room, Roz could hear Salvatore talking with Uncle Gianni, and the strange thing was that his voice sounded lighter in a way she had never heard before, without that constant weight of guardedness, and when she glanced through the doorway, she saw him laughing, a real laugh, at some joke from the uncle who had once suspected her so deeply. Gianni himself, after everything, had slowly changed the way he saw her, because he had witnessed Salvatore trade an entire empire to protect her. And he understood that no one did such a thing for a spy, that people only did it for a feeling that was real, all the way to the core. That evening, when the whole family gathered around the long dining table, with candlelight shimmering and laughter rising warmly through the room, Salvatore found Roz's hand beneath the table and gave it a gentle squeeze, and she squeezed back, the two of them exchanging a quiet look in the middle of all that warmth. Roz realized that the wound inside her, the hollow of 18 years since losing her mother, since losing Danny, was slowly being filled not by anything grand, but by small, ordinary pieces of life like this: a batch of dough, an embrace, a hand gently squeezing hers beneath the table. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she truly had a place where she belonged. 1 year had passed since that fateful gala evening, and when the annual family celebration came again, Roz stepped once more into the Ferraro family garden, but this time everything was different. There was no apron carrying the smell of burned coffee, no tray of drinks waiting to spill, no lie she had to strain herself to perform all the way through, and most important of all, no dark shadow of Cormac lingering by the garden gate. This time she came as herself, invited with all sincerity, and when Antonia saw her, the woman's face lit up in exactly the way that had once melted Roz's heart in the old diner 1 year before. Only now that joy was no longer built on the sand of a misunderstanding, but stood firmly on the ground of a complete truth. The garden was still alive with laughter. The children still chased one another across the grass with little flags in their hands. Nana Lucia still sat in her familiar wheelchair beneath the trees, this time giving Roz a slight nod with the eyes of someone who had known everything all along. And Uncle Gianni, the man who had once suspected her so deeply, now poured her a glass of fine champagne with his own hands, and gave her an awkward smile that was an apology, without needing to be spoken aloud. Salvatore stood among his family, no longer the man carrying the weight of an entire hidden empire on his shoulders, no longer with that constant guardedness in his eyes, but simply a man running an honest shipping company, a man who had learned how to smile without calculation, and when he watched Roz cross the garden toward him, his gaze said everything the two of them had endured to arrive at this moment. That night, after the party had ended and the last fireworks had gone dark across the sky, Roz still had a shift at Marlowe's, because even though her life had changed, she was still herself, still keeping her work and her pride, still refusing to let anyone buy away the independence she had struggled all her life to claim. Salvatore drove her to the diner, and when her shift ended at that familiar late hour, when the whole city was asleep and only the yellowish light of the old diner remained, Roz sank down onto the booth seat, exhausted after the long day, her thin shoulders sagging, and then the unexpected happened. Salvatore, the man who had once made the whole harbor hold its breath, quietly stood, walked around behind the counter where she had served him through so many nights, took the pot in his own hand, and filled a cup with hot coffee. He set it down in front of her, gently, then said in that deep, warm voice she knew by heart, "Black, no sugar. You sit right there. Tonight let me." Roz looked at the cup of coffee, then at the man standing behind the counter where she had stood all her life, the man who had let go of everything he had once possessed so he could become an ordinary man, pouring her a cup of coffee, and her tears fell silently, not from sadness, but because for the first time in her difficult life, someone was serving her not because he pitied her, not because she owed anyone anything, but simply because she deserved to be cherished. 1 year before, she had spilled an entire tray of limonada on a stranger's shoes and been turned into a lie with a price, a poor girl with nothing but her pride. Now she sat behind her own counter, watching the man who had once made an entire city tremble pour her a cup of coffee, with hands that had released every form of power in order to live truthfully, and she realized that being seen by someone exactly as she was, being treasured for herself and not for anything else, was the richest thing a human being could ever possess. The story of Roz and Salvatore reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a person's dignity is never measured by the money in their pocket or the power in their hands, that the poorest person can still be rich in character, and the most powerful person can still be poor in soul, until they learn how to cherish another human being exactly as they are. Sometimes the greatest luxury in this world is not wealth, but simply being seen by someone, being heard, and being loved for who you are. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video so we can listen together to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. How do you feel about Roz and Salvatore's story? What part of their journey moved you the most? Please leave a comment below so we can hear the honest feelings from deep within your heart. Thank you for spending your time listening until the very last moment. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.